You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 496 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast. As y'all will recall, we used the last episode to look at the Overland Campaign from the standpoint of casualties and prisoners of war. Then, looking ahead to this show, we said that while every campaign during the Civil War brought hardship, the nonstop stress associated with the Overland Campaign stunned everyone, and as May wore on, the psychic landscape of the participants was increasingly dominated by crushing fatigue and constant anxiety.
In a letter to his wife, Julia, Ulysses S. Grant said, quote, "The world has never seen so bloody or protracted a battle as the one being fought, and I hope never will again." Grant's correspondence during this time often opened with a reference to the sustained nature of the campaign. One dispatch to Washington began, "We have now ended the 6th day of very heavy fighting." Another began by noting, "The 8th day of battle closes." And in a letter to Julia, "The 9th day of battle is just closing."
Other men kept track as well. Soldiers recorded, quote, "We have been fighting continuously for 6 days. Quote, "The battle has been raging here for 12 days with more or less ferocity." And, quote, "Today is the 15th in which our men have been in line of battle."
On May 17th, as he welcomed the rains that forced a pause in Grant's campaign, a soldier explained to his girl back home, "We need the rest, as we have worked day and night since we started. In all other fights, it has not lasted but 2 or 3 days, but we have been in this one about 2 weeks.
It's impossible to overestimate the impact of this grinding tempo on the soldiers forced to endure it. Sheer existence was an ordeal, even setting aside the crack of gunfire, the screech of shells, and the constant fear of wounds and death.
Modern armies possess a well-oiled logistical and medical support system to support, sustain, and care for the frontline soldier. However, during the Civil War, the individual soldier not only had to march, fight, dig entrenchments, and perform picket duty, he also had to feed himself, find his own water, clean his own clothes, and bury his own dead. Unsurprisingly, he couldn't do it all. For example, in the wilderness, exhausted men fell asleep as soon as the shooting stopped after the first day's fighting. When combat resumed the next morning, most had not eaten the evening before, and now they had no time for breakfast, so they fought that day with the coffee in their bellies or nothing at all.
Even when the men had time and energy to prepare meals, the raw material was uninspiring, to say the least. And for the Confederates, there was never enough. Confederate Sergeant John Worsham recalled that at this stage of the war, he and his comrades received half a pound of bacon or beef each day, supplemented by 1.5 pounds of flour or cornmeal, or 1 pound of cornbread or hard bread, all of which was just about half the officially prescribed daily ration.
Worsham noted that real coffee was so scarce that when it was issued at all, it was, quote, in quantity so small that the grains were counted out to each man, end quote. And on the Confederate side of the lines, everyone from private to field officer fared much the same. While at Spotsylvania, Jubal Early visited Robert E. Lee's headquarters and received an invitation to stay for supper. Old Jube recalled that the meal consisted of, quote, a scanty supply of hard crackers, fried bacon, and a beverage made as a substitute for coffee out of parched wheat without sugar.
Federals got more than their rebel counterparts, but it amounted to an almost steady diet of salt pork and hardtack, the latter being a thick cracker about 4 inches square and about as chewy as a rock. Rations sometimes gave out entirely for a day or two when soldiers on the march outpaced the supply wagons, or the mud made it impossible to get rations to the front. A 6th Corps soldier wrote, I know a man who gave $9 for 9 hard pieces of bread. A person at home can't hardly imagine or believe how a soldier has to suffer in all kinds of hardships.
On the positive side, Federal soldiers occasionally got fresh beef, since the Army of the Potomac brought with it over 1,000 head of cattle to be killed, butchered, and issued to the troops on the march. But, as with many other things, the care and ultimate slaughter of the cattle became an additional duty for the common soldier, since the commissary would issue the cattle, in all their mooing, cud-chewing glory, directly to corps, divisions, brigades, and ultimately individual units.
Infantrymen were stuck with whatever their commissaries gave them, but cavalry had the luxury of being able to forage. One of Sheridan's troopers, after returning to camp, told his diary, quote, we got great loads of smoked pork, some flour and butter, etc., fried pork, slapjacks, corn pone, hoe cake, bread and gravy, and a little molasses.
However, if his taste buds gloried in such grub, his stomach had a different reaction, since his next diary entry reports, quote, about sick, vomiting and purging, ate too freely and too rich after so long a time of almost utter fasting.
During the campaign, the men frequently went thirsty since water was often scarce. The colonel of a New York regiment recalled, quote, no water could be found, as no springs or running brooks were in the wilderness. Men died from thirst, many from excitement and sunstroke.
He amended his report to state there was indeed, quote, one little stream, almost dry, called Piney Branch Creek. However, he said it was only handy to the troops who happened to be fighting near it, quote, though muddy water was carried from it considerable distances.
Men endured what they had to in order to survive, but at times it hardly seemed worth the trouble. Late in the campaign, a Federal surgeon grumbled, I am tired to death lying here drinking Chickahominy swamp water in which 1,000 horses are decomposing. It is drink this water, eat half-cooked fresh beef before it is half dead, run to the latrine every 15 minutes, and sleep with stenches under your nose sufficient to cause a turkey buzzard to contract typhoid fever, and keep doing it until you get used to it.
Well, nature itself seemed to conspire against the men. A soldier from Massachusetts ran into a patch of poison ivy, and in a letter to his wife told her, I do not feel well today. My eyes are almost shut up, and my messmates are all laughing at me. Besides poison ivy, the woods were infested with ticks. A Union chaplain awoke one morning to find himself and a fellow priest, quote-unquote, literally covered with them. In his memoirs, he devoted a long paragraph to the episode, telling his readers in great detail what must be done to rid oneself of them. Writing in 1894, the good father realized his audience might find it odd that he should devote a good deal of ink to such a thing, but that, he said, was precisely the reason. Quote, hundreds, thousands I may say, have written up those conflicts and painted them in the bloodiest colors, whereas few, if any, have entered at length into the details of other trials and sufferings incurred by the poor soldier while serving his country.
In the days before bug spray, wood ticks were not the only torment. Clouds of mosquitoes lavished attention on one and all, while cavalrymen endured a hazard unique to their branch of service, the horsefly. One Pennsylvanian attested, quote, their bites or stings and their after-touches seem to create misery in the marrow of one's bones.
Probably the worst plague, though, was lice. The commander of the 6th Wisconsin, Rufus Dawes, ordered his men one day to construct breastworks, and later rode over to see how they were progressing. Far from wielding spades and axes, the soldiers had stripped off their uniforms and were utterly absorbed in the business of killing the hated graybacks. The men explained that this was their first chance to do so in weeks, and they were taking advantage of the opportunity.
Often the only effective solution was to boil the afflicted clothing. This sometimes had an unintended side effect as the clothing shrank. Dawes recalled how, quote, once a man brought to me one of his shrunk-up shirts in a package to be sent by mail. He said he thought it would about fit the baby.
Well, usually the men had no time to kill lice or even change their uniforms, and given the mud and dirt, it seemed pointless to even try. On May 25th, Dawes wrote to his wife, I have not changed my clothes since May 3rd. When soldiers finally did don fresh clothing, the act was frequently important enough to merit attention in one's diary or letter home. The getting of shelter was another noteworthy event, so we know that the troopers of the 1st New Jersey Cavalry slept in tents for the first time in over 3 weeks on May 25th.
For the most part, the men slept on the ground, often in their trenches, with only a rubber blanket. Drenching rain and seas of mud made sleep sometimes as miserable as staying awake, and even dry ground had its disadvantages. Private Theodore Garish of the 20th Maine declared, I shall always believe that the soil of Virginia is at least several degrees harder than any other state.
But whatever the discomforts that attended it, men nevertheless craved sleep. A federal officer estimated that the Army was getting by on but, quote, 2 to 4 hours per day. It is the hardest campaigning I have ever seen. Before it commenced, I would not have believed that I could have gone through it.
A Pennsylvanian attested that in 25 days he got one night's sleep, quote, and this was the average for the whole Army.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
Poor or inadequate food, bad water, insects and pests, and fatigue steadily ground both armies down, sapping the troops of strength and wrecking their health. As May wore on, almost everyone, officers and enlisted men alike, suffered from diarrhea, fever, or some other ailment. a substantial percentage became sufficiently ill to require evacuation. For example, statistics for the Army of the Potomac, including Burnside's 9th Corps, list the number of sick transported from Fredericksburg to Washington as 4,225, which was over 16% of the total evacuations. Confederate losses due to illness are unknown, but were probably similar in proportion to overall strength.
At times it seemed as if neither side could endure the strain. Confederate General Brian Grimes echoed the opinion of officers in both armies when he informed his wife on May 19th, quote, "This is the 15th day since we have met the enemy, have been fighting more or less every day. If they would retire beyond the river and give us a breathing spell, it would be decidedly advantageous. Nearly all are exhausted and need rest."
The toll on the soldiers was not only physical, but psychological as well, since the Overland Campaign kept soldiers in almost perpetual tension and danger. During warfare in the 19th century, such a state was still fairly rare. Except in sieges, when troops might be under continual threat of bombardment, combat was most often a matter of a few hours or even a few minutes. Soldiers would enter the fighting from a state of relative security, endure a brief interlude of battle, but afterward they returned to a state of security once again, for days, weeks, or even months.
This had critical implications for a soldier's ability to withstand the ordeal of war. Lord Moran, in his classic study, The Anatomy of Courage, argues, quote, "Courage is a moral quality. It is the fixed resolve not to quit, an act of renunciation which must be made not once but many times by the power of the will. Courage is willpower."
Most soldiers had courage when it counted, but virtually any man could lose it. Lord Moran was a veteran of the First World War, and he noted, quote, "In the trenches, a man's willpower was his capital, and he was always spending. When his capital ran out, he was finished."
Moran wrote in 1945, when physiologists and psychologists still had a comparatively sketchy grasp of what happens to human beings under stress. Although quite right about courage, if defined as the ability to function effectively in the face of danger, he was, as he implicitly conceded elsewhere in his book, wrong about its being purely a moral quality.
Certainly it requires an effort of will for a person consciously aware of danger to choose to remain in its presence. But this effort of will gets a strong assist from the body's ability to adapt to stress, to maintain, in ways that are half conscious, half visceral, what military psychiatrist John Shaw has termed, quote, "an illusion of personal safety," end quote, which is the irrational confidence that whatever happens to those around him, the subject himself is likely to survive.
A soldier thus has two lines of psychological defense. One, a conviction, consciously cultivated and maintained, that facing danger was a moral imperative, and two, an illusion of personal safety whereby he and his biochemistry conspired to believe that despite the danger, he would continue to be all right.
However, during the Civil War, by 1864, most veterans found the illusion of personal safety to be impossible to maintain in any conscious way, so they sought it indirectly. Many took refuge in Christianity and its promise of eternal life. Religious revivals swept both armies during the winter of 1863-64, especially in the Army of Northern Virginia, which witnessed an estimated 7,000 conversion experiences in the months before the start of the Overland Campaign.
A Mississippi private may well have honestly recalled that the night before the Battle of the Wilderness, quote, "I slept a solid, dreamless sleep, as peaceful as a child. Mentally, I had already given up my life to the keeping of the Lord, and said in my soul, not my will, but thine be done.
While some found solace in their faith, others took their fatalism straight. From Spotsylvania, Rufus Dawes warned his wife that, quote, the probabilities of coming out safe are strongly against me. If we may only finish this horrible business here, our lives are of poor moment in comparison.
Late in the campaign, a soldier in a Michigan regiment described the ferocity of the combat in a letter and asked his readers back home to, quote, imagine yourself as a target for 1,000 shots a minute, and then think what a slim chance a soldier has to come out of this all safe.
Experiments in behavioral psychology have demonstrated that subjects who possess no ability to control a painful stimulus experience less stress than those who do. Therefore, reining in the belief that one's battlefield choices could affect one's survival would thus be a powerful adaptive technique. Even so, it was rare for soldiers to embrace the full logic of their fatalism. Soldiers who resigned themselves to the will of God routinely thanked him for sparing their lives and espoused, tacitly or overtly, a theory of divine protection. Or they simply contradicted themselves. 2 sentences after asking his family to imagine facing 1,000 shots a minute, the same Michigan soldier reassured them, quote, you must not worry too much about me, for I have been in danger for most of 2 years and been in some of the hardest fighting of the war and have not yet been hurt.
The illusion of personal safety, for its part, didn't prevent the shortness of breath, pounding heart, and urge to flee that characterizes the body's response to danger. It simply made these sensations more manageable. A federal surgeon described a young soldier in the wilderness, quote, going to what may have been his death, with pallid face and trembling lips, yet with his head erect and eyes to the front, end quote. The surgeon thought it was a, quote, wonderful example of mind over matter.
Another federal soldier noted that he often felt greater fear before an action than during it. He stated that, quote, the actual reality met face to face serves only to stimulate and embolden one, end quote. Well, he was describing, of course, the effect of adrenaline, which tends to initially provoke flight, but if one remains in a dangerous situation, just as effectively unleashes ferocious activity. However, the body's supply of adrenaline isn't inexhaustible. That means constant exposure to danger outstrips the body's ability to synthesize new supplies. That means stress becomes much harder to manage. For example, after 10 days of combat, a federal officer admitted, quote, it is dreadful to be kept in a constant state of excitement like this.
The illusion of personal safety, by definition irrational, paradoxically requires a certain amount of genuine safety to sustain it. Lord Moran and others observed that soldiers who are placed in harm's way for too long decrease in effectiveness until they become almost useless. In contemporary terms, they have succumbed to combat stress reaction, sometimes called post-traumatic stress disorder.
During World War II, one U.S. Army doctor concluded that lack of sleep brought on by intense anxiety was the critical factor in combat fatigue, as it was then diagnosed. He treated patients with massive sedation that guaranteed a solid period of rest. 30% of his patients returned to combat duty within a day, while over 70% did so after 48 hours. In this respect, during the Overland Campaign, the 2 armies' interlude at the North Anna River undoubtedly played an important role in preserving the troops' effectiveness.
For 2 days, the armies broke contact, recreating a sense of relative safety, and although many units were in combat at one time or another during the next week, the fighting wasn't continual.
One gets a sense from reading first-person accounts that during this period, the men found new energy and spirit, or to use Lord Moran's metaphor, they replenished some of their capital, such as the North Carolinian in a May 26 letter to his wife, who said, "I have slept undisturbed for 2 nights, and also slept a good portion of the daytime, and feel considerably revived."
But it's difficult to escape the conclusion that the campaign gradually eroded the troops' military effectiveness. Observers saw it in their reluctance to press home assaults and in the brittleness of even veteran units, which would run like sheep when their morale broke, such as happened with the Iron Brigade at Jericho Mill.
Not only did casualties and fatigue grind down the armies, but the nature of combat often ensured the heaviest losses were suffered by the bravest, most dutiful soldiers. The problem was especially acute in the Army of the Potomac, whose veterans had 2 additional sources of strain. First, lack of confidence in the new recruits, bounty jumpers, and heavy artillery regiments that made up the Army's replacements. And second, veteran regiments whose enlistments were about to expire.
Late in the campaign, a federal officer noted, quote, "Our time is reduced to 19 days, but from present appearance, they will be terrible days. The 2nd Rhode Island has got but 4 days more, and if they get into a fight, I don't think they will stand a minute. It makes all the difference in the world with men's courage. They dread awfully to get hit just as their time is out."
In reality, most of these short-timers ably acquitted themselves to the very end, but nonetheless, the perception that they were unreliable was at least as important as the reality. And speaking of perception having a way of becoming reality, what was being purchased by all this death, injury, and suffering? Well, as May wore on, soldiers and civilians alike grappled with that question. With the next show, we'll take a look at how they answered it, since their opinions mattered because they had direct implications for morale and motivation. Soldiers who think they're winning generally fight better than those who think they're losing. And in a democracy, civilian opinion matters just as much, since it factors into the home front's willingness to sustain the cause and support elected officials who will see the fight through to the end.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is actually several books which explore the psychological impact of the Civil War, including the concept of what we now call PTSD.
Shook Over Hell, Post-Traumatic Stress, Vietnam, and the Civil War by Eric T. Dean Jr. specifically examines the prevalence and manifestation of PTSD in both Civil War and Vietnam War veterans. Other works, like Invisible Wounds, Mental Illness and Civil War Soldiers by Dylan J. Carroll, delve into the broader spectrum of mental health challenges faced by soldiers during that era. Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War by Brian Matthew Jordan focuses on the reintegration challenges faced by Union veterans, highlighting the psychological and physical traumas they carried.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info about how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast in that way. Just last week, we released members episode number 161, titled An Unfortunate War of Words, which looks at the post-war feud between Winfield Scott Hancock and John Gibbon regarding just what happened in the wilderness on the morning of May 6, 1864.
We hope all the members enjoyed that show, including the newest members, Cody A., Carter, and Ori P.
All right, and with that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thanks for listening. Tracy and I do hope that you tune in next time too, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.